Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for being here, first and foremost. My name is Sheila Gutierrez. I'm the Garden Program Coordinator at Green Venture. And on the line, we have Julia, our youth volunteer, who will be monitoring the chat room. And we're joined by Kennedy from Finding Flowers, and of course, our speaker today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Your mics are muted to ensure the quality of sound. So please, throughout the presentation, keep your mics muted. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box so that we can monitor those questions for a question and answer period at the end. Today, I have the honor to stream from Eco House, situated on traditional territory of Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Attawandaron nations. At Eco House, it's a historic farmland, and today it is full of pollinator patches, rain gardens, a Milwaukee forest demonstration, and many other environmental demonstrations. And at Green Venture, we are committed to reconciliation and learning how we can be better caretakers of the land. And we invite you today to join the conversation and see how you can also support that work. Our next presenter will discuss plants, language, and land, and Mike's connection to Hamilton through Gage Park. Thank you for joining us for this presentation titled Finding Flowers, Indigenous Plants, Language, and Land. Lisa is an Anishinaabe artist, chef, and curator, as well as an associate professor in the Faculty of Urban and Environmental Change and Research Chair of Indigenous Art and Curatorial Practice at York University. Based in Port Severn and Toronto, Lisa's artistic practice considers the relationship between food systems, place, and memory. Previous works have used blueberry pigment as a medium in printmaking, stop motion animation, and participatory performance, reflecting on themes of place and displacement, of straining and absorbing. Her work has been exhibited in venues such as Kitchener, Waterloo, Art Gallery, the Art Gallery of Peterborough, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. Lisa Myers is also one of the lead investigators of Finding Flowers, an interdisciplinary collaboration that integrates art, ecology, and education within a biocultural approach to native plant and pollinator conservation, and takes inspiration from the Indigenous medicine and butterfly gardens planted by the late Mi'kmaq artist Mike MacDonald. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the floor to Lisa now. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks for that intro. That was really nice. I will share my screen if that's okay.
Definitely.
'Cause I have the ultimate in PowerPoints today.
Yes.
As ultimate as PowerPoints can be. Yeah, so I want to say miigwech to the organizers of CD Saturday there in Hamilton for inviting me, and it's a real honor to get to talk. And I love the spirit and the intention of CD Saturdays in general, and the sort of sharing of seeds, especially around this time. This is around the time when I start thinking about, sometimes it doesn't get done until later, but start your seeds for the garden, right? And since COVID, my personal garden here in Port Severn, we expanded it. We doubled its size, and because I think through lockdown and things like that, we started thinking about food, how we can build our own food sources better. So it kind of urged us to move into making a nice garden. So I'm really happy to be here. That's my general kind of feelings right now. So Bojo, Lisa Myers, Indigenous cause, Nisoe Gamikwe Indigo, Wabsheshi Dodem, Gajimsing Ndonjaba, Port Severn and Toronto Dinda, Mio Manika Ikadoyan Nongam. So I'm a language learner too. I'm interested, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm really interested in Anishinaabe Moan. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, cool. Anishinaabe Moan are the first language of my grandfather. And I've been sort of learning that or picking that up over the past, well, a really long time, since I was probably, I don't even want to say how long, but it was a long time. So anyway, but I am honored and humbled to be here and to talk about language. And so part of this research is is centering language now. I'm sort of shifting that way. So anyway, I introduced myself. I said hello. I told you that my name is Lisa Myers. I told you my Anishinaabe name, Nisaway Gamikwe, and that I'm Martin Clan, and my community is Gitchimnising. I didn't grow up there, but I moved between that space and Shawanaga First Nation, which is where a lot of my family are from. Anyway, and I'm also just saying thank you for listening to me today. So I'm going to go into this presentation, and it reflects a paper that I have been working on for a while for an anthology around land back. So I'm thinking about land, I'm thinking about language and plant knowledge and how those are intertwined. And what I realized from presenting this just last week in a class, presenting a similar version of this in a class last week at York, was how much this work is also around land and law, and also around indigenous law. So these are things I'm still sort of building a bit into this paper, and also learning a lot about it as I go. So here we go. I'm gonna read a bit, and I'll probably go off the script a little bit too. My cursor has disappeared. Oh, there it is. Okay. So black swallowtail, cabbage white monarch, morning cloak, red admiral, silver skipper, silvery blue skipper, sulfur, tawny crescent, tiger swallowtail, Vanessa, and white admiral are all the butterflies listed with an animated GIF of each and an annotation of the plants that they depend on for laying their eggs. From 1998 to 2002, Mike MacDonald, the late artist, Mi'kmaq artist Mike MacDonald, developed his digital garden website, and it is this work that I consider the overlap of digital media and gardens. This net art project by Mike presents his teachers and some of what he gathered in working with butterflies and medicine plants. So through his work, he considered butterflies as teachers. So if we think of land and waterways as readable, a kind of document without edges of a page limiting its breadth, rather with a range that is fluid and ever-changing, then we can see how one's understanding of land grows over long periods of time. And I'm using this metaphor of a paper document in this instance to play with the material fibers that convey the way that land is mapped, governed, and upheld through colonial logics of resources and property outlined legally usually through a paper trail of contracts and permits. So permits and legislation can permits enable mining and logging and other extractive industries across large areas of land, changing physical space quickly and interrupting cultural legibility of land. Such changes also happen legislatively. For example, Omnibus Bill 197 here in Ontario is fast-tracking permits for development administered through and held within the surface and edges of paper documents. The late Mi'kmaq artist Mike MacDonald, who was also of Beothuk and European ancestry, was a documentarian and media artist who later in his practice created medicine and butterfly garden artworks. He passed on in 2006 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And as a curator and artist, Adrian Stimpson states, MacDonald was a warrior for the environment. Since first writing about MacDonald's work in 2014, I've been extremely drawn to it. His early video work, his installations, and also his garden artworks. I too studied video, and I also ran a community garden at an Indigenous organization north of Toronto for about 9 years. And at that time, I learned about medicine plants, and I also planted medicine gardens. Other artists have responded to MacDonald's work, and from the work of Anne Riley and C. Weiss, I learned that Mike MacDonald was also gay or two-spirit. His work, when I look at his work and his writing, it doesn't overtly express this part of his identity, but many artists and curators have referenced the symbolism of butterflies and transformation as metaphors for two-spirit identity. I've not found any of his writing that clearly states how he identified, whether he used the term two-spirit, gay, or queer to name himself. So I mention this, and I want to keep the terms open, but acknowledge how important I find his two-spirit identity for me as an Indigenous queer person myself who's been drawn to research his work. So through documentaries, McDonald features contestations where extractive industries such as clear-cut logging or mining undermined Indigenous peoples' land, rights revealing conflict between Indigenous peoples, the state of Canada, and industry. And that's a trifecta that always seems to be at play. So this is around access and sovereignty to land for resource extraction. Elsewhere, I argue that this video work is evidence and has evidentiary value of Indigenous peoples' connection to their traditional lands. However, here I want to think through McDonald's Medicine Butterfly Garden artworks as more than a response to resource extraction, but as a sites to assert energy towards continuance of plant knowledge and language. Through my research on his gardens, I seek to understand how these gardens reinscribe plant and language knowledge within the land, as McDonald's garden artworks emerge from a similar place and time as his video work. Considering recent texts on Indigenous studies on plants and place, plant knowledge is relevant in the context of Aboriginal rights to land and recognized in law through treaty rights and land claims. And I just use the word Aboriginal there because I'm kind of referencing law, Canadian Constitution, which still uses that term. For example, in the case of Silcotin versus British Columbia, ethno-ecological and ethnobotanical evidence from elders and other expert witnesses played a pivotal role in helping the Silcotin nation establish at trial that they exclusively occupied their lands, acknowledging the problematics of the colonial recognition of occupancy. But at the same time, I think it's really interesting and compelling to know that plant knowledge was used in this way in the court. Plants and trees are part of Anishinaabe terms of good life, Minobimadzwin. Potawatomi scholars Kyle White's concept of collective continuance is useful in thinking about how language and plant knowledge are connected. White explains that cultural continuities such as language, monomen, cultivation are part of self-determination. For example, monomen or wild rice cultivation are part of self-determination and resistance to domination. And he calls these ecologies for continuance. I appreciate this concept in this decolonial and anti-colonial assertion. And I take it up as a lens through which to consider McDonald's garden projects in the realm of land back and in terms of considering how a garden that encourages learning about plant medicines and the interconnection of living beings. And so it makes me think of Anishinaabe creation story where plants came before almost all other beings. And so they are the teachers in the sense that they do lead to learning about sustenance, food, healing, insects, water, soil. And I'm particularly interested in centering language as it is also connected to land, Anishinaabe Mun. Considering McDonald's gardens within the paradigm of returning land and land back, I feel that that planting native plants on municipal lands and urban spaces reinscribes, or I want to propose this, that it kind of reinscribes plants that were once abundant in that place, but also it's a way of inserting a kind of mnemonic, a reminder, a remembering to call on Indigenous language and plant land knowledge, which is one part of the intangible value of land. And that is our language, or our languages. In this way, these gardens are living archives of relations, including the relations between plant, pollinator, soil, sunlight, water, and many other elements, including human interaction. And as an artwork, these gardens have symbolism and representational meaning, ecological function, cultural and relational purpose and existence. The term garden carries connotations of imperialist expansion of empire through concepts of land and landscape and landscaping. And within landscaping lies an attendant reference to agriculture and Lockean theories of land as productive only through agriculture. So I want to think about Mike MacDonald's gardens differently than that, because they're not ornamental French or English gardens, nor are they agricultural crops. Growing and cultivation take different forms for First Nations peoples, and our aid in the cultivation of plants may happen through propagation and planting, but also through the way we harvest and forage, if we do harvest and forage perennial foods, to be sure that they will grow back and continue to proliferate, so leaving some for others. In this way, I see McDonald's use of the term garden as not just meaning plants and flowers, but the ecologies and interdependence within these growing spaces. I also see these gardens as sites that may compel the institution that hosts them as artworks to consider the land and bureaucracy involved in putting in a planting space, which takes the curatorial concern out of the gallery proper, outside the vault, where all the art collection is, and out of the building onto the land. As shared with me by Anishinaabe artist curator William Kingfisher, the word for garden in Anishinaabe is gitagan. It means spots on the land. Well, that's been one way of translating it, which suggests leaving a mark and a trace of being. McDonald's gardens are such spaces, leaving marks and traces of plant knowledge and its interconnectedness. I also associate McDonald's gardens as spaces of resistance, their form and materials as resisting monocultures in many forms, intervening in the institutions to look at the care of the land and to tend to. So in the way, some of the gardens that we've replanted in Finding Flowers have included, have meant that we've dug up grassy lawns, and I think about a monoculture. One of the monocultures that is so common is the lawn and the culture around lawns. And scholar Paul Robbins explains. He points to the control over the environment that a lawn represents. So he wrote this book about lawns, and I thought that was really interesting, and that maintaining this kind of turf and its ecological and economic consequences. So they further take up land, these gardens, and are resilient in their rootedness and the perennial ways, roots, leaves, flowers, and fruit as they host pollinators and other beings. Anishinaabe curator Wanda Nanabush explains that the word resistance translated into Anishinaabe dialect infers rootedness, and she elucidates the resistance, and I quote, becomes a metaphor for planting or planted. And in a sense, being rooted is part of the concept of resistance. As artworks planted outside of museums or galleries, McDonald's work further resists the position of the fine art object, which I think is really interesting. It's almost like in seeing how galleries and museums take on these artworks, these gardens that are artworks, is really revealing in how the institution's capacity can handle such an artwork, because the care for it is so high. Just one second. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So I approached these gardens as an Anishinaabe artist curator who is also a language learner, as I mentioned, and I'm interested in understanding how land, language, and plant knowledge connect. I'm also considering that McDonald's artwork involved planting on sites across this land that we know as Canada. Therefore, these gardens exist or existed on many different traditional lands of First Nations communities. And surrounded by diverse plant life and pollinator life and languages. So each garden is composed in distinct ways, but all of his gardens incorporate Indigenous plants from the region that offer sources of medicinal qualities and habitat for butterflies and other pollinators, and likely other wild pollinators, I should say, who have co-evolved with these plants. So McDonald was born in 1941 in Sydney, Nova Scotia, which is within Mi'kmaq territory. He lived for many years in Vancouver, BC. His artwork is part of major collections at the National Gallery of Canada, Vancouver Art Gallery of Ontario, Kamloops Art Gallery, and has been exhibited nationally and internationally. He started making documentaries in the late 70s for anti-nuclear activist groups, and by the 1980s, he dedicated his video work to Indigenous issues, making documentaries for the Native Brotherhood in British Columbia, and then others. From researching and planting McDonald's gardens, I've come to understand them as spaces of contemplation and places for slowing down to be in relation to other living beings. I've thought of them as knowledge systems, meaning they hold space for the interconnectedness between human, plant, soil, and insect mutualisms. His video and garden artworks comprise a constellation that asserts interconnection between human and more than human relations, offering a perspective that questions large-scale resource extraction projects. He wrote about that. He wrote about how he wanted the gardens to start people thinking about their relationship to the environment or land, and to reconsider the ways that resources are extracted. So there's a kind of that contemplative part, and that kind of reflexive part is really important, I think, from what I've deciphered. So I consider his gardens. I consider his gardens as a kind of restoration as well. However, restoration seems to suggest being resolved or solved, and I find that McDonald's Gardens raise more questions and tensions rather than merely solving the problems of ecologically and socially, the sort of ecological concerns. McDonald planted his gardens across the country and would drive from coast to coast each summer to tend to them. This mapping and remapping with the planting of gardens and also tending to them asserts a reinscription of land through restoring Indigenous flora. Yet in some cases, he introduces a contradiction or a tension in the form of a plant that is not Indigenous and seemingly may be or will seem out of place. Adaptive and adopted, these introduced plants from Europe or outside of Canada open up the concept of invasive, suggesting a metaphor for, or I guess invasive, exotic invasive, suggesting a metaphor for colonization. And that's something Mike wrote about in one of his gardens, which I'll talk about. The invasive, introduced, or misplaced insect or plant appears in different ways through McDonald's Gardens. But through his garden work by design, and also because gardens are porous and open to the dispersal of seeds in the wind and carried by animals. Seeds are key players in the ecology of migration and evidence of the movement that plays out in these growing spaces. Within some of McDonald's writings, he reflects on the focus of Indigenous plants, but also the symbolism, value, and use of introduced plants. So in this way, his project was not just about sort of restoring the land through these garden projects, just, restoring the Indigenous plants. It wasn't just about that. These gardens as artworks have symbolism. He composed them in a way to make meaning. So I feel like that tension of the invasive plant or the exotic plant and the Indigenous plant was really key. Professor and scholar of Indigenous knowledge and ecological stewardship complicates the Indigenous and invasive plant binary as his study. So Nicholas Rio writes about invasive. Well, Nicholas Rio and all a large research team research invasive species. In First Nations or Indigenous communities, and many of the communities that they worked with across North America, they realized that determining that community initiatives and actions with issues of invasive species is part of self-determination for communities. So many communities turn to traditional knowledge and working with elders and to find approaches to mitigate invasives without causing more harm to the land. And this is an area of this paper that I'm really interested in building up and talking about the combination of plants that he introduces. So this map that you're seeing in front of you shows the gardens that we know of that he planted across the country, and you can see right from the East Coast to the far West Coast. And I'll just say that most of these gardens don't exist anymore, but from our research, we're replanting some of them, and that means like actually really engaging with the communities there and the communities in different places to see whether a garden is needed to be planted again. So it's not about parachuting in and plopping down a garden. In 1999, McDonald planted a butterfly garden at the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre in Alberta. And to my knowledge, this is the only one of his gardens that still exists. As part of the gallery's collection, the garden is cared for and maintained. In this research with Sheila Colla and Dana Prieto and Kenny Halverson in Finding Flowers, we visited this garden in August 2019 with the specific intention of learning more about McDonald through the garden. So, whoops. Okay. Planted between two buildings, plants and shrubs grow on either side of a cobblestone path. And at first glance, the garden looks untended and somewhat feral. And although distinct from a composed ornamental garden, this garden takes up the identity of what I call the bush and signifies a remoteness where trees, plants, and shrubs are mostly left to their own inclinations. As an artwork, McDonald's butterfly garden has a care plan. However, over the last 22 years, seeds have spread, rhizomes have nestled beyond their original planting, and branches reach far from their original saplings. Oops, shoot. In 2009, the gallery invited curator, educator, and caretaker of McDonald's Butterfly Garden, Catherine Ilatalo, to join in the caretaking and stewardship of the garden. In her article, Mike MacDonald's Butterfly Garden, The Little Garden That Could, Ilatalo explains she approached the garden as a curator and horticulturalist, wanting to understand the artist's intention. With her work, she started mapping the garden, and you can see here, this is the cobblestone path in the middle, and then these are the gardens on either side. And so she has, she mapped it out. And it showed that there was more than like around 93 plants present in this space. And some of them obviously maybe creeped in there, and she has this ongoing plan to remove some of the more aggressive exotics. So you can see on here an ongoing invasive species removal, and then she has them categorized in all these different, with the shrubs, the wildflowers, the grasses. In planting this garden, McDonald purchased some plants. You know, he bought some from some of the local greenhouses, but he also transplanted plants. So I want to just remind you all, as I'm saying this, that so this garden is at the Banff Centre for the Arts. And it's part of the Walter Phillips Gallery collection. And so the Art Center is in Banff, Alberta, and Banff is a national park. So that introduces a whole other realm of like land use and, you know, being able, you know, the sort of what you're allowed to do. So as recounted by one of the preparators, that's someone who was helping him put in the garden at Walter Phillips, he said they would drive around the park in a pickup truck, stopping at different places to find and learn about the plants. And then he would dig some up if he thought about if there was a plant that he came across while on these drives that were really important to butterflies, he would dig it up. And as I mentioned before, important to his work are the tensions between plants that are indigenous to his site, including some that are introduced species. This inclusion was not merely an intervention by McDonald, but a reflection of the reality that the plants had already established themselves. This leads to a plant story shared with me one early morning by a long-time employee of the Banff Centre. He had to let me in this door so I could go through this building to get to the garden. Anyway, he reminded me, and he walked with me and we sat in the garden together talking. He reminded me that planting a garden in a national park means following guidelines and observing restrictions on what plants can be used. The park's experts oversaw and approved each plant's appropriateness to the integrity of the flora in this protected area, which is interesting when we see a little Talos survey of the garden that many introduced plants are present and no one can really control invasive species. McDonald had to go through a process of paperwork that involved getting approval for the plants he planned to include in the garden. He presented the park, so this is all in 1999 when he's doing all this. He presented the park biologist with a plant list and it was approved except for one. McDonald asked the official why he did not approve the stinging nettle, and the park's rep said the plant is not indigenous to the park. We don't have it here. So McDonald informed him, informed him that the park has a red admiral butterfly and therefore has to have the stinging nettle as the butterfly lays its eggs on that plant. And what I like about this exchange in this story is that McDonald could read this space, this park, this protected area in such detail that his understanding of the medicine and butterflies, the medicine plants and butterflies was meticulous. And the story was so important to understanding the way that McDonald worked and how there were institutional challenges and tensions within these garden artworks. Whether in the case where our one plant seemed to not belong, or whether it was him digging up plants within a national park and for his own artwork. So part of the maintenance of the Banff Garden is ongoing removal of thistle, vetch, oxeye daisy, and buttercup. In researching this site, our team also gave back to the space by tending to it and pulling out large amounts of vetch vines and that are aggressive ground cover, and they climb up other plants, and also removing thistle plants. So you can see here, Dana Prieto is the research associate on this project. So this was our day pulling out vetch from the garden, and this, I guess, happens maybe spring and fall at least, or in the fall, I guess, late summer. We were in late summer. This was August. And to mark our time there, we made some dyebaths with the vetch and the thistle, and we dyed these cotton pieces, which we'll probably make something out of them as the project continues. Okay. So I just want to give you a bit more context to his work. So now you know a little bit about one of his gardens, and you know that he built a bunch of gardens and he traveled across the country tending to them. But I want you to know that earlier, before he started doing garden work, he did a lot of video, as I mentioned, documentary, but also video installations. And so during the late 80s and early 90s, McDonald worked with the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en Tribal Council to document oral histories from elders who were not able to go to court to testify in support of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en challenge to the provincial government and the Crown for title and jurisdiction over their land. And what we know now, we know this as the Dalgamuk case. It's well known. It was a decade long. It's like a very famous court case. And through this time working in Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en territory, he also made video installation sculptures that use the arrangement of video monitors to display complex compositions of synced videos, creating a chorus of video work. So this Seven Sisters brings together images of the Seven Sister Mountain Range in Gitxsan territory in the northern interior of what is now known as British Columbia. Seven Sisters is a 7-monitor video sculpture where each monitor is a different size, signifying the different peaks of the BC mountain range with the same name. And throughout the duration of the videos, scenes change from the idyllic, scenic mountainous landscapes with treetops and rock outcrops to aerial shots of similar regions with clear-cut logging. And what I refer to as a kind of redaction of the landscape, where the knowledge, memories, songs, and stories of this place still exist, but the ecosystem is degraded or, cut down, and swaths of forests are mostly removed, eroding away the knowledge attached to that, which is obscured. The videos then change to scenes from Natural History Museum of close-up shots presenting taxidermy mountain wildlife, signaling colonial logics of museum collections, but also reminding us the sort of use of these. The use and the display of these animals. McDonald explains that this work calls for changing methods of resource extraction, as I mentioned earlier, and the video installation is also accompanied by a healing song sung by Gitxsan hereditary chief Mary Johnson. And as McDonald explains, that this soundtrack is supposed to heal land. It is set to heal land. In his book, in the book Hungry Listening, sound scholar Dylan Robinson describes how songs can function to prove relationship to place and territory. And this is kind of like from a Gitxsan, he's sort of recounting a Gitxsan perspective on this. Emphasizing its events, relations, and pasts, Robinson goes on to recount that Chief Mary Johnson sang a time immemorial song in court as evidence, or attempted to, evidence supporting Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en proof of jurisdiction over their territories. So earlier I talked about plant knowledge being part of a court case. In this instance, part of the evidence that was being presented was a song to prove a bond and occupancy of their land, of their territory. And although the presiding judge would not hear this example of song as evidence of people's bond to their territory, makes me consider that the legibility of land is also part of the memory, stories, and understanding of a place that the song evokes. These are integral to the rights and privileges of territory. And in that case, the judge, and do I have his name? Darn, I wish no, I don't have his name. So I'm gonna have to add that. But the judge at the time, he wouldn't listen to the song. He said that he had a tin ear and he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't listen to the song. So it was like a really interesting point where Indigenous law around occupancy and bond and of territory, which was being presented in the form of this song, clashed with Western with Canadian law, and very literally right in the courtroom. And it's a pretty awesome moment. Like when I read that, I just thought, wow, this is incredible. So the song was somewhat denied, although the song still prevails as a strong evidence of territorial rights and privileges. So I want to just talk about also his artwork, Electronic Totem, which serves further as poetics of evidence in presenting the Gitsan's bond and understanding of their territory, as each monitor shows fishing, berry picking, and other positive living with Chief Mary Johnson singing. And so I'm sort of showing you all these to show that the trajectory of McDonald's work connects to Indigenous territory and land contestations. And you can see like Canadian law and Indigenous laws are kind of coming into collision. One of the origin stories of McDonald's turn to planting gardens as artworks comes from sites of contested land and land slated for clear cutting. So from this interview with art critic John Grand, McDonald recounts his experiences working with elders on a medicine plant project in the Gitsan community. During this project, he was taking photos of plants in a valley near Kitawanga, BC, and butterflies would often land on the plants and flowers he was photographing, or he was shooting with video. He showed these images to the elders he was working with, and she explained, or one woman explained that the butterfly would show him the medicine plants he needed to heal and be healthy. From then on, McDonald considered butterflies as teachers and would study the plant that he observed and he observed them landing on. So this is in part the beginning of his work with medicine plants and butterflies. He continued to learn more about medicinal plants and to research the mutualisms between these plants and butterflies. He continued to learn by hosting butterflies in his backyard in Vancouver by planting 60 Indigenous plant varieties. However, even this urban habitat was vulnerable because they started spraying BTK to combat gypsy moths. And so part of the origin stories of his gardens was that he was trying to create habitats to protect the butterflies. And this artwork, Secret Flowers, which is a 16 monitor video installation, references that very directly. It shows images of butterflies, and then it shows images of overhead spraying that he recorded, things like that. So it's a really prolific piece. So with Finding Flowers, we did all this research, learning about all his gardens. Our first planting of one of the gardens began with, let me just check. Yeah, I'll answer all the questions after. Okay, so our first replanting was Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery with senior curator Crystal Mowry, who connected with the Woodland Cultural Centre in Brantford, Ontario. So these two towns are kind of close together. They both exist on what's called the Haldeman Tract. In part, Mowry reached out on behalf of the regional public gallery that she worked at the time, Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery, to this museum on Six Nations Cultural Center because of the location of the museum on the Haldeman Tract. So in some ways, I think about Crystal as really starting to acknowledge, or being in the process, and was really acknowledging well the land that the gallery was on. But I think this kind of brought her consideration into another level, I guess. So this is the garden that was originally Mike MacDonald did it for a show called Natural Inclinations, curated by Tom Hill. The garden, when we visited, a few years ago with Crystal, when we visited the Woodland Cultural Center in Brantford, the garden was no longer there. But we talked to the curator at the time and asked her if, and Naomi Johnson asked Naomi if she would be interested in us replanting it, and if it would be okay to replant it at the Woodland Cultural Center, but also plant it at the Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery. And she was very much into it, as she was very much interested in that as the curator there. And she told us a story that she told us about her experience when Mike put the garden in, because she worked as an intern at the Woodland Cultural Center that summer, and so put together a catalog for the show. I'm gonna just skip a little bit forward. Here we go. So this is the catalog she created, and what was beautiful is that we actually were able to see this this kind of recipe for the garden. So it shows like the plants that would be there. They all around this circle. They all represent. This is sort of this is a bird's eye view of the composition of the garden. Each circle here on these corners represent not only where a teepee pole would be planted, would be like stabilized, but also shows that he planted hops at each teepee pole. So that they could grow up the pole. Hops are these rhizomes that have like little hairs, and they climb. They're really good climbers, and they're really prolific and tenacious. So hops have origins in Europe. They grow like vines and have small cone-like flowers called stromboli, which are commonly harvested for flavoring beer, for making tea, and other edible uses. And they have rhizome root systems, meaning these roots are like stems and are prolific and tenacious. Multiple stems grow from the crown of the rhizome and twine around each other, covered in stiff hairs. They grab onto surfaces, and therefore they can climb each pole, expanding and creating shade over the garden in mid and late summer. So how might we consider the symbolism of the tenacious climbing hop plant? These material and symbolic tensions are similar to my mention of the stinging nettle in the Banff garden. I'll just really say, I want to say really quickly, and I know that I'm running maybe a little bit long, but I do want to point out the significance of the replanting of the garden in Brantford and in Kitchener. I think it's really important to mention that this is something that happened. This is part of that this strip of land, the Haldeman Tract, has a history that is not really taught in schools. Six Nations history includes the contentious and unfulfilled Haldeman Proclamation of 1784, which intended that the land 6 miles on either side of the river from Elora, Ontario, that the land 6 miles on either side of the river from Elora, Ontario to Lake Erie would compensate the Haudenosaunee after fighting alongside the British in the American Revolution. And knowing they had not fulfilled an agreement to ensure the Six Nations original lands, which was like in New York State and other places, the British promised that the Grand River tract of land, they promised them this tract of land, but the land transfer did not happen, and the reparations resulted in the much smaller land base of Six Nations, which you can see on the map in yellow. Moving the community was a long drawn out process of British capitalist expansion, and the imposition of private property and land ownership meant that the state could reallocate land and its use in Ontario. So I think that's a significant part of the land use, and that's important, an important part of these plantings, the context of these plantings. We sourced plants from greenhouses, and we did try to support, or got quite a lot of them from Gaanase, which is a greenhouse in at Six Nations. But also I wanted to do some transplanting, and I wanted to think about the plants that I live with here in Port Severn and what I'm surrounded by. And so I sort of like what I'm maybe have a fluency in or a kind of literacy in, like I recognize these plants. And so we were in early spring and not all the things had flowered yet. So I had to like really exercise my ability to recognize Joe Pyeweed or goldenrod or asters or milkweed without their blooms. And what I did, I did this with Dana Prieto, that was a research associate on the project, and I sent her to the safer place to dig up wild strawberries for the garden. And then I took the challenge to dig up a couple of milkweed plants that were growing among poison ivy. So this story has the success of identifying plants and confirming that I really know, or I kind of know, the plants that that grow around me. But I also the other part of the story is my overconfidence of thinking I can dig up a plant without making contact with the very ruling poison ivy. So the twin planting of the gardens are symbolic of creating connections between museums and the Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery, building more understanding of the land they're on. And due to COVID, we haven't had the gatherings and collaborations around the garden spaces we had hoped we'd hoped to have so far. But through this beginning, we've learned from the plants and the pollinators they attract, and they continue to flourish. So here's a shot of the garden at Woodland Cultural Center. This was in the summer of 2019. You can see the sweetgrass in the middle and all the plants just starting. And then this is the garden at Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery. And you can see the teepee poles. And this is right at the beginning, so you don't see the hops going up yet. And here's another shot where you can see the hops starting to grow. So as we continue planning, we have now a garden that's inspired by Mike MacDonald's work at the Ositsuwan, which is a contemporary Indigenous art gallery in Edmonton. And we're planning to plant another one at the Mount St. Vincent Art Gallery, which will be the replanting, because Mike planted one there, I think in 2000. And then also Secwepemc artist Tanya Willard of Bush Gallery is hosting a McDonald garden that we'll be planting this spring during a residency with students from, I think from UBC Okanagan. And then we're also working on another garden like the one at the Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery that will be at Moosegetties, which is in Guelph, Ontario. Okay, so so you can see the hops do grow up to the top, and you can see throughout the garden there are early blooms like strawberries. There's the cone flowers, which are later, and then the asters and the goldenrod that are even later into the fall. So providing food for pollinators all year round. In the year 2000, Hamilton Artist Inc., which is Hamilton's oldest artist-run center, in case you don't know that, produced the project called Zone 6B. And it was organized and curated by Shirley Maddle and Ivan Jurakic, sorry. So Hamilton Inc. published a catalog in 2003 that includes image and artist statement for Mike MacDonald's commissioned artwork, Butterfly Reservation, which Butterfly Reservation was commissioned as a garden project in Gage Park. So Ivan shared with me during my time in Hamilton where Mike planted his garden, and it's in these gardens called the perennial border gardens. At the time were prized, I get what I gather, prized composed kind of Victorian gardens. Mike's intervention in these gardens. He planted Indigenous plants. He also planted a lot of, he planted a lot of Shasta daisies or maybe oxeye daisies. A lot of daisies that seem to really take off in the photographs anyway that I see. Mike's intervention, so he went in the garden, and instead of like redoing the garden and making it a Mike MacDonald garden, he intervened in the existing space. So the exact plants he planted are no longer there, as the gardens were replanted about a decade ago. But we can imagine that it's true that the seeds traveled, rhizomes merged beyond their original rooting, and with these plants, he carved out a butterfly reservation among the busy city center. We're here at the perennial borders garden. You can see you can see the new replanting, but I like to imagine that we can still see that, some of the plants that he planted are popping up, that you can't just like change a garden over without really seeing some remnants of the past. And so I was kind of delighted at that. So I created this piece in sort of in combination with like my research about Mike's Gardens. So as a curator, I'm researching that, and I'm putting together exhibitions, and we're replanting gardens in conjunction with community and with organizations in different cities. But when I went to Hamilton, and there just seemed to be very little information about his work there in Gage Park, and no one really at the park even knew that it had existed, because we talked to some of the workers and things like that while I was planning this artwork that I made, which is an audio walk called Finding What Grows. So it's an audio walk created by me through a series of just walks through the park itself. So it guides listeners around Gage Park and invites them to consider the relationships and interconnection between land, humans, pollinators, and plants. And it starts at the Children's Museum. There's a big anchor outside the Children's Museum, this really huge metal, anchor. And that's where I decided to start the walk. And the walk takes you through, takes you to these trees that are marked with seem to be marked with spray paint. And so that leads you to the rose garden, then leads you to a corralled area of trees that are kind of surrounded by fences. Then the walk takes you to the really big fountain, a very grand kind of fountain that has, some well-to-do Hamilton citizen's name on the side of the fountain. And it then takes you through to some cedar grove, a little cedar grove. And throughout the walk, I ask you to consider the space, but different details. I ask you to make different gestures, or to stop and contemplate. And then it takes you over to the perennial border gardens. And so here are some pictures that were of documentation of Mike doing a garden tour and walk with people from Hamilton. You can see one of his photographs on the back of his shirt there. And this is him picking up, and you can see some of the daisies around. I think it's really interesting to think of it as butterfly reservation. I think there's probably, I know for myself walking around in that park, it very much it really reads as this kind of attempt to bring the world to one spot, a very colonial kind of logic in terms of, how many different kinds of exotic plants can we bring to one place so that we can all enjoy them. So it has that in a way, a kind of expo of the world in one spot. But I'm not, and it sounds sort of critical. I have a critical eye on it, but at the same time, when I went to the beautiful greenhouse they have there, I was really delighted to see an actual vanilla bean plant, vanilla bean orchid, or all of these things. So there is this kind of wonderment to that, but I would say that it's definitely that it makes me think of the huge expos at the turn of the century, where the Chicago Expo that brought all these things to one spot to bring the world to a community. Anyway, So as we continue this project, each site comes from the local communities, whether they are urban, Indigenous, or on reserve. And as mentioned earlier, McDonald's Medicine Butterfly Garden artworks are more than a response or reaction to colonial landscapes. They are sites to assert energy towards continuance of land and plant knowledge and language. They represent a way of looking at the world that does not separate humans and nature. And if we think of land and waterways as readable, a kind of document without the edges of a page limiting its breadth, rather with a range that is fluid and ever-changing, living and legible, then we can see how one's understanding of land grows over long periods of time. Miigwech, that's the rest. That's all I'm going to say for now. And I can take questions if you're still